The Voice of America presents Forum, the Arts and Sciences in Mid-Century America. Today, Forum brings you Professor Max Black of Cornell University, who will speak on the justification of induction. Professor Black's talk will be the 16th lecture in the Forum Philosophy of Science series, planned and coordinated for the Voice of America by Professor Sidney Morgenbesser of Columbia University. Professor Black was born in Russia and has been an American citizen since 1948. He received his Bachelor of Arts degree from Cambridge University and both the Doctorate of Philosophy and Doctorate of Literature degrees from London University. Formerly a professor of philosophy at the University of Illinois, Professor Black has been a member of the faculty at Cornell University since 1946. He has been a visiting professor at Columbia University, the University of Washington, Harvard University, and Kyoto University in Japan. In 1962, he served as a visiting lecturer in India for the United States Department of State. Dr. Black has been a Guggenheim Fellow and a recipient of a National Science Foundation research grant. He has been a president of the American Philosophical Association and was recently elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. A former editor of the Journal of Symbolic Logic and the Philosophical Review, he is currently the editor of the Contemporary Philosophy series. Professor Black.
If a dog barks at me each time I pass by, I naturally expect him to bark again the next time he sees me. This is an example of inductive reasoning in its most primitive form. From knowledge about a sample of cases, those in which the dog has already barked, I draw a conclusion about a case not included in that sample. I anticipate what will happen the next time. Let us now take a more sophisticated example. On applying a lighted match to a scrap of cellophane, I find that it catches fire. I conclude that any similar piece of cellophane would also burn in a similar situation. Here we have an inference from what happened in one case to what would happen in any similar case. One last example. An entomologist finds that each examined beetle of a certain species has a green spot on its back and concludes that all beetles of that species will have the same marking. Such familiar examples of inductive reasoning involve a transition from information about a given set of objects or situations to a conclusion about some wider, more inclusive set. We might say that all of them consist of reasoning from samples. Let us therefore agree to understand by an inductive argument one in which the conclusion refers to at least one thing that is not referred to by the premises. The simplest form of inductive arguments, on whose correctness the more sophisticated ones ultimately depend, can be represented as follows. Such and such A's are B, therefore another A is B. Or again, some A's selected in such and such a fashion are B, therefore all A's are B. We need not consider ways of improving these formulas, since the problem of justifying induction remains essentially the same in all forms of inductive reasoning, whether primitive or sophisticated. It has been held, very widely, though not universally, that the use of inductive reasoning is a distinctive feature of scientific method, integrally connected with the discovery of scientific laws and generalizations. In strict deductive reasoning, we are limited to rearranging information about the data referred to in the premises and never advance to knowledge about the hitherto unobserved. By means of inductive reasoning, however, we make the leap from some to all, from the known present to the predicted future, from the finite data of observation to laws covering all that will be and could be. The so-called inductive leap from some to any and all seems indispensable in science no less than in ordinary life. Indeed, the very language we use to refer to persons and material objects implies a belief in the permanence of objects and the continuity of their properties that can be grounded only in inductive reasoning from experience. There can be no serious question of human beings rejecting inductive reasoning as unsound. To do so would be tantamount to destroying the very language we use to talk about the universe and about ourselves, and would lead to the kind of last-ditch skepticism that lacks even the words to express itself. It is altogether reasonable to wonder how the use of this powerful method of reasoning can be justified. Indeed, certain features of inductive argument, as we have defined it, can easily awaken serious disquiet. In logic, we have all been taught that the transition from a sum in the premises to an all in the conclusion is a transparent fallacy. If some men are white-skinned, it by no means follows that all men are. How then can we be justified in wholesale violation of this plain and simple rule? Again, inductions are notoriously fallible. The gambler who expects a sequence of reds on the roulette wheel to continue indefinitely will soon be undeceived. In our dealings with nature, are we in any stronger position than the gambler who has had a lucky sequence of throws? Are we perhaps about to come to the end of our lucky guesses about nature? How can we possibly know that the sun will rise tomorrow? For the sake of clarity, it is essential to distinguish such sweeping skeptical doubts from practical questions about the reliability of inductive procedures. It is one thing to ask whether a given inductive procedure is sufficiently reliable for a given purpose. Different and more basic questions are at issue when we ask how any inductive argument can be justified. We have well-tested methods for discriminating random events, such as those that occur on a roulette table, from lawful ones. Where a practical decision is in question, it would be foolish to consider the contingency that the sun might not rise the next day. On the other hand, in cases where inductive conclusions based upon sampling are relatively unreliable, we know in principle how to improve the reliability of the sampling process. There is no difficulty in principle about meeting any practical criticism of a given inductive procedure. By contrast, the question of justification raised by the philosopher is one of the utmost generality. He is perplexed to understand how any inductive reasoning, no matter how satisfactory by the standards of common sense or of good statistical practice, can really count as acceptable. He finds it hard to understand how the inductive leap, which seems to involve a plain logical fallacy, could ever be justified. The problem has no immediate bearing upon scientific practice, but is of the first importance for evaluating the claims of science to be a vehicle of truth about the universe. It seems that unless induction can be justified, our claims to have scientific knowledge must be rejected as unfounded, and science will have to count as no better than any other unsubstantiated faith. However appealing such a skeptical conclusion might be to those who welcome any proof of man's impotence, it is one to be accepted only after the most careful investigation. In the course of the intensive consideration that philosophers of science have given to this problem, almost every conceivable answer has been defended. First, perhaps the most drastic solution available consists of a denial that induction plays, or ought to play, any part in scientific method. This view has been most eloquently defended in recent times by Professor Karl Popper, who has argued in numerous writings that the proper business of science is the deductive testing of empirical hypotheses. According to him, there is no rational way of arriving at generalizations from the examination of sampled cases, no rational way of making the inductive leap. But once such a generalization has been produced, by whatever means, there is a rational way of discovering whether it meets the tests of observation and experiment. Such generalizations or hypotheses can be conclusively falsified, but never verified, never shown to be true. The task of empirical science is falsification, putting to the trial of experience bold conjectures about the world, and not the impossible task of discovering truth. For all the ingenuity with which this provocative view has been argued, to which I cannot do justice in this brief report, the no-induction view, as it might be called, has not received wide acceptance. It seems too paradoxical a conception of science that it should consist only of the elimination of error rather than the progressive discovery of approximations to the truth. An induction seems to creep in by the back door in Popper's theory of corroboration, that is, of the criteria by which we discriminate between the relative strengths of hypotheses, none of which are falsified by the known observational facts. Secondly, one might think that common sense can provide a simple and satisfactory answer to the problem of induction. If a layman is asked why he trusts an inductive argument from some to all, the chances are he will say that this kind of argument has always worked in the past. One might have some doubts about that always, but no matter. How foolish it would be, we can imagine the plain man saying, to abandon techniques that have worked so well and have produced such spectacular successes in technology and in pure science. Well, let it be granted that induction has worked in the past. What grounds does this give us for expecting it to work in the future? If we conclude that induction will work because it has worked, we are arguing inductively. As the philosopher David Hume pointed out long ago in a famous discussion of the problem, we seem here to be begging the question. The best method we have for settling specific empirical questions, arguing from the known character of observed instances, leaves us in the lurch when we try to find a general justification of induction. To offer an inductive justification to anybody who doubts that induction is ever justified is obviously futile. On the other hand, some modern writers have argued, with some success, that inductive arguments can be applied to themselves in order to improve their own reliability. It is at any rate not obvious that any objectionable circularity is here involved. The status of such so-called self-supporting inductive arguments is still controversial. In any case, self-supporting arguments, even if allowed to be sound, have no direct bearing upon the general problem of justification. Thirdly, a favorite approach to the problem of justification begins by asserting that inductive arguments, in the form considered in this lecture, are basically incomplete. Transition from some to all, from a premise about a sample to a conclusion about the population from which that sample was drawn, is held to rely upon unstated assumptions. Until such assumptions are made explicit, the inductive inference is unsound. The inductive leap is never justified by itself. An inductive argument needs an extra premise in order to become valid. There needs to be supplied some principle that the future will resemble the past, or some more general principle of the uniformity of nature. Once such a principle has been introduced into the argument, and only then, will that argument become logically respectable. It will be noticed that this line of attack on the problem tacitly assumes that only deductive argument is irreproachable. By implicitly denying the possibility of distinctive inductive arguments, this position resembles the no-induction view previously mentioned. The formulation of general principles that might plausibly play the part of missing premises in inductive arguments is a matter of great difficulty. Since nature obviously exhibits variety as well as uniformity, irregularity as well as order, it is hard to state a principle of uniformity without producing something that is plainly false. For example, the principle that whenever some A's are B, all A's are B, is a grotesque overstatement. And even such a sophisticated version as John Maynard Keynes's famous principle of the limitation of independent variety has been subjected to damaging criticism. It seems fair to say that nobody has yet produced a suitably qualified candidate for the title of the basic principle of inductive inference, though many have tried. We need not enter into the difficult technicalities of this attempt to bolster induction by supplying an additional grand premise. There is, in my opinion, a conclusive objection against this whole line of approach. Imagine the desired general principle produced. Then it will be either a priori true or contingently true. If the first, it is a necessary truth, holding independently of the facts, like a logical or mathematical principle. But then it cannot support the transition from some to all. It is easy to see that if the conclusion of an inductive argument does not follow deductively from the premises, the case is not altered when a necessary truth is added to the premises. But if the proposed principle is contingently true, it would not hold in all possible worlds, but must formulate something true of our universe. How then is its truth to be known? Only, it seems, by the familiar methods, the best we know, of observation and inductive reasoning. Indeed, we may go further. Our confidence in particular laws of nature, the conclusions of inductive inferences, is better grounded than our confidence in the truth of any alleged principle about the general uniformity of nature. Such evidence as we have for the orderliness of the universe is derived from our knowledge of particular regularities and not vice versa. The search for grand principles of induction therefore merely shifts the problem without solving it. The problem of establishing such principles is just the old one of justifying induction in another and even less tractable form. I turn finally to the so-called pragmatic justifications of induction, which have seemed to many modern students of the problem to provide a satisfactory answer to this ancient puzzle. The basic ideas underlying this approach were independently formulated by Charles Sanders Peirce and by Hans Reichenbach, the latter of whom argued the position with great ingenuity and pertinacity. Consider the following familiar position in ordinary life. A doctor who is treating a patient suffering from some serious disease has reason to believe that the only chance of saving his life is to perform a certain operation. Suppose also that there is no guarantee of the operation's proving successful. If the doctor is right in thinking that the patient will die in any case if the operation is not performed, he is justified in operating. To put the matter in another way, if a necessary condition for saving the patient's life is performing the operation, then that operation is justified, even though the outcome is unknown and the risks are great. This might be called a case of nothing to lose by trying. Resort to the dangerous operation may be a forlorn hope, but it is a justifiable one. Those who apply this idea to the justification of induction argue as follows. Hume was right when he said that it was impossible to argue from the present to the future, from the known to the unknown. The inductive leap cannot be justified in the way that philosophers and scientists have hoped. Nevertheless, we badly need knowledge ranging beyond our observations, and nothing can prevent us from trying to obtain it. Suppose it could be shown that the only way to reach such knowledge is by following inductive procedures. then we should be in the position of the doctor or the patient in the original example, with nothing to lose by trying. If following inductive procedures is a necessary condition for anticipating the unknown, we shall be practically, or, as people say, pragmatically, justified in following that procedure. We may agree that the general line of argument is plausible. Its contribution to the problem of justifying induction will depend upon how successful its defenders are in showing that some kind of inductive procedure is a necessary condition for making correct generalizations about the unknown or the unobserved. The model usually employed has approximately the following character. Suppose we are performing a series of observations and are interested in some property P. If in the first 100 trials we find that P has appeared in 65 cases, we assume provisionally that in the long run the proportion of favorable cases will be close to 65 over 100. As we continue our trials, we may find, say, 87 favorable cases in the first 150 observations. We therefore correct our estimate and now expect the proportion of favorable cases to be near to 85 over 150. We proceed in this same way. Whenever we find that K out of L trials exhibit the property P, we provisionally assume that the proportion in the long run will be close to K over L. Since there is no guarantee that the fractions we progressively find in this way will ultimately converge to a limit, our attempt to anticipate the overall character of the entire series of observations may be defeated after all. But if there is a limit which we cannot know, this procedure of successive correction will eventually bring us close to the true value of that limit. We are justified in following the procedure because we have nothing to lose. If the series of successive fractions is sufficiently irregular, no method of forecasting its ultimate character will be possible, while if it has the regularity of a convergent series, our method will bring us close to the desired answer sooner or later. This idea is too ingenious and too complicated to be criticized in a few words. I have argued at length elsewhere that it fails. Some of the strongest objections that I and other critics have brought to light are technical ones, having to do with the impossibility, according to the pragmatic view, of preferring one method of estimation to another. But the basic objection is that the whole approach concedes too much to the skeptical critics of induction. Those who agree with Hume that knowledge of the unobserved is, strictly speaking, impossible, will always find themselves with empty hands at the conclusion of an inductive procedure, no matter how ingeniously they try to wriggle out of their predicament. We seem now to have arrived at a stalemate. None of the ways of justifying induction that have been explored by a long line of able and acute thinkers seems to offer any prospects of success. Attempts to justify induction by using inductive procedures seem hopelessly circular. Attempts to find principles expressing the alleged uniformity of nature simply raise the old questions in a new form. Introducing probability statements does not help, and the fashionable pragmatic justifications really leave us helpless against skeptical objections to induction. Considering the intensity with which the problem has been studied, there is no hope that we shall do better where so many powerful intellects have labored in vain. Now, when we meet with a situation like this, there is usually reason to suppose that the nature of the problem has been misconceived and that the apparently insurmountable difficulties arise from misunderstanding. The view is steadily gaining ground that this is the situation with regard to the celebrated problem of justifying induction. The very notion of justification implies some standard of justification. To justify induction must be to show that that kind of reasoning satisfies some relevant criterion of what is regarded as reasonable. Now, the long history of the subject shows that nearly everybody who has grappled with the problem has really had before his mind the standard of deductive reasoning. However widely the various attempts to justify induction differ, they all assume that the only really reputable mode of reasoning, the only strict method, is that in which the conclusion follows by logical necessity from the premises. But induction, by definition, is not deduction. The idea of the so-called inductive leap is built into our conception of an inductive argument. To try to convert inductive arguments into deductive ones is as futile an attempt as that of the child who argued that a horse was really a cow, only without horns. The beginning of wisdom in this extremely complicated and controversial domain is therefore the recognition that no general justification of induction, of the sort that philosophers of science have hoped to uncover, is either possible or needed. What we mean by justifying a specific empirical generalization is an inductive demonstration using principles that have been found to work in the kind of case in question, that the generalization is true or at least probable. When we try to apply this relatively definite notion of justification to induction itself, the very notion of justification becomes unclear. It is not so much that we do not know how to justify induction, as that we do not know and cannot imagine what we would accept as such a justification. Clarity here, which cannot of course be achieved without the hardest intellectual labor, ought to result in the disappearance of the alleged problem of induction. If this view is correct, as I hold it to be, the problem of induction will be eventually classified with such famous insoluble problems as that of squaring the circle or that of inventing perpetual motion machines. And as in those famous cases, the quest for the impossible does not seem, from the long perspective of history, to have been futile, for the byproducts of serious investigation may be even more important than its ostensible goal. If our knowledge of the character of inductive procedures is as rich and as sophisticated as it is today, no little of the credit must be assigned to those who have labored so long and so unsuccessfully at trying to justify induction.
You have heard Professor Max Black of Cornell University speak on the justification of induction. Next week, Professor Paul K. Feyerabend of the University of California will speak on problems of microphysics as the final lecture in the Philosophy of Science series. Professor Feyerabend is a well-known authority on quantum theory, epistemology, and linguistic philosophy, and was awarded the Austrian President's Prize for the Sciences and the Fine Arts in 1954. Copies of the lectures in the Philosophy of Science series may be obtained after the entire series has been broadcast by writing to the Forum Editor, Voice of America, Washington 25, D.C. And now, this is Morris Joyce, inviting you to join us again next week at this time, when the Voice of America will present Forum, the Arts and Sciences in Mid-Century America.